ואנו מכריזים בזאת
I'm very sure this is The View from Israel. And today I'd like to talk to you about the nefarious actions of Iran. Iran, we know that they have proxies surrounding us here in the Middle East. And also I'd like to talk about Iran, a different aspect that many of you don't know about its surrounding and infiltrating into the United States, which is even more nefarious. But to help me sketch out this picture, I've invited a special guest, Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, to the show. Yoram, welcome to The View from Israel.
Thank you very much.
Yoram Ettinger was the Israeli Consul General in Houston, Texas, but before that he was the Minister for Congressional Affairs acting out of the Israeli Embassy in Washington, D.C. He has many contacts from that day even to today in the United States. And if somebody who knows about the inside the dealings within the United States, I think Ambassador Yoram Ettinger is the best man I could ask onto the show. Yoram, thank you. First of all, give me a brief description of the encroaching of and the threats of Iran to Israel in the area.
Well, there is an assumption that supposedly Iran, the Ayatollahs of Iran, are focused on Israel, and their prime strategic goal is the destruction of Israel. While this is one of their goals, it is certainly not the top goal. The Ayatollahs of Iran follow an agenda, follow a vision, and that vision is 1400-year-old. For the Ayatollahs of Iran, the 7th century is today, is maybe yesterday, but it's a very, very active and alive reality. They are driven by a vision of supremacy, and the supremacy is not limited to the Persian Gulf, not to the Middle East, not to East or West or North Africa. It's a global megalomaniacal vision, which, by the way, extends today as we speak to Latin America, all the way from southern Chile to the US-Mexico border. And the reason the Ayatollahs, together, by the way, with their proxy, Hezbollah, have been entrenched, deeply entrenched, in Latin America since the early 1980s, shortly after they took over control of Iran back in February of 1979. The reason for their preoccupation with Latin America, because they correctly consider Latin America to be the soft underbelly of the US, otherwise known in Tehran as the Great American Satan. And since the top priority, as far as they are concerned, is to bring the Great American Satan to submission, therefore, they have concentrated on Latin America conventionally, not through any non-conventional or nuclear capabilities. And being entrenched in Latin America means that, again, going back to the 1980s, they have forged very close ties with every single drug cartel in Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil. They have forged very close ties with every terror organization in Latin America, and certainly with every American government in Latin America. And as unfortunately we know today, there are very, very few non-anti-American, non-pro-Iranian governments today in Latin America. The focus of the centerpiece of that entrenchment in Latin America have been the two tri-border areas. The first one, the most formidable one, is Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. And then there is the small tri-border area of Chile and Bolivia and Peru. Those tri-border areas have been very attractive for the Ayatollahs, as they have been for every entity of terrorism and drug trafficking and money laundering anywhere in the world. And going back again to the early 1980s, the Ayatollahs and Hezbollah established themselves very much in those two tri-border areas. The capital, so to speak, of the large tri-border area has been Ciudad del Este in Paraguay, and this is where the crux of the Ayatollah's money laundering, drug trafficking has been going on with their Hezbollah proxy. They have established themselves very deeply in anti-US Venezuela. And that means not only establishing, erecting areas where they test ballistic capabilities, where they test new developments in the area of Predator unmanned aerial vehicles, but they are also training terrorists in Venezuela and in the tri-border areas. Some of the terrorists remain in the American hemisphere, targeting the U.S. Homeland, and some are sent to the Middle East. We are talking about Iran supplying Venezuela and the drug cartels with equipment to erect an underground tunnel. And those tunnels are the same as they helped constructing in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, haunting Israel today. They have provided those capabilities to the drug cartels, specifically the Mexican drug cartels, in order to construct underground tunnels into the U.S., trafficking both drugs and terrorists into the United States. Hezbollah terrorists have been involved very, very much in training drug cartels in the areas of car bombs and the IEDs, the improvised explosive devices, which they intend to activate on U.S. soil. And that type of preoccupation has been a derivative of their vision, again, to bring the great American Satan, as they call it, to submission. Many people in the West would take it very lightly as a delusionary type of policy on the part of Iran. They view it, and in my mind correctly, as very realistic goal for simple reason. They look back in 1979 when they toppled the Shah of Iran, took over control of Iran, by the way, with great help by the U.S. State Department, which has been wrong and wronger and wrongest on Iran and the Middle East since then, and in fact, since 1948 until today. And when they look back at to February 79, when they took over control, they were hardly a second-tier power in the region, in the world. Today, they certainly are within the top tier, strategically speaking, and globally speaking, and that certainly is a source of optimism for them. But more importantly, we have to realize we're talking about the Ayatollahs of Iran, whose vision is entrenched in the 7th century and hasn't changed an iota since they have taken over Iran. Recently, by the way, the so-called supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, is talking more and more about the battle between the front of Ali, namely the Shiite front, and the front of Yazid. Yazid was the Sunni caliph who, according to Shiite view of the world, betrayed the Shiites and massacred the forces of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and that took place in the Battle of Karbala in 680 AD. Now, for many Westerns, 680 AD is anywhere from irrelevant to maybe an enjoyable reading material. For Middle Eastern, for the Ayatollahs, this is a live and kicking event which has inspired the Ayatollahs from day one. They commemorate the 680 Battle of Karbala, where the Sunnis supposedly betrayed the Shiites, and many of the viewers may recall the processions by Shiites, not only in Iran and Lebanon, but also in major cities in the West where there are Shiite communities, processions in Chicago, in London, in Paris, in other parts of the US, where with Shiite males walking bare-chested on the street, holding iron bars, flagellating themselves on the back and on the chest, bleeding. And this is an annual commemoration of the vow, the Shiite vow, to take vengeance of the betrayal of the Shiites by the Sunnis. And every enemy, every threat is referred to as Yazid, that Sunni caliph who massacred the Shiite forces of Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, and the vow, which has become the strategy of the Ayatollahs. The vow is not only to take vengeance and topple every single Yazid regime, namely every single Sunni regime, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Bahrain, and then Egypt and Jordan and Oman, all the way to Morocco, but also to bring the infidel Western culture to submission, focusing on the number one entity within that infidel West, namely the United States. And that has been translated into daily subversion and terrorism in the Middle East, namely subverting Saudi Arabia. Why Saudi Arabia? Because the Saudis control Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites of Islam, including the Shiites, and therefore the duty as the Shiites feel to rid those two holy sites, to rid them of the rule by the treacherous Sunnis. Also, there is a competition with Saudi Arabia over domination of the Muslim world, certainly domination of the Persian Gulf, also domination of the Persian Gulf, which means 48% of global oil reserves. And that includes major the major oil area in Saudi Arabia, which is the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And guess what? Most of the inhabitants in the oil-rich eastern region of Saudi Arabia, most of the population there are Shiites. The Shiites are something like 20% minority inside Saudi Arabia, but they are a vast majority in the oil-rich area of Saudi Arabia, and that has become a fertile ground for Iranian subversion and terrorism in the area, in their part of their attempt to topple the current Sunni regime in Saudi Arabia. We are talking not only the Persian Gulf and not only the Middle East, where they have already took over control of Iraq and partly of Syria and Lebanon, and certainly to a large extent of Yemen, but they attempt to expand it, for instance, into Jordan, which has become a prime arena for the Ayatollahs of Iran, with the help of Iran-supported terrorists from Iraq and Syria, and certainly domestic terrorists, the Muslim Brotherhood of Jordan. And the reason they're trying to topple the current pro-US Hashemite regime is obvious. Once they try, and they succeed to topple the pro-US Hashemite regime, they're going to engulf Israel completely in the north, Iranian-controlled Lebanon and Syria. In the east, it would be Iranian-controlled or Iranian-influenced Jordan, and then the south, Iranian-influence-controlled Gaza. And at the same time, if they topple the pro-US Hashemite regime in Jordan, they also succeed in engulfing the Sunni regime in Saudi Arabia, pro-US Saudi Arabia, from the north Jordan, from the east Iraq and Iran, from the south Yemen. And that's a would be a major coup for Iran, undermining global stability, undermining the source of oil, where 48% of global oil reserves are located. Certainly, the Arabian Peninsula controls the major trade route between the Far East and Europe, namely the Arabian Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Red Sea. And that would be a bonanza for the rivals and the enemies of the US. That would be a coup for Russia and China, the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ayatollahs of Iran, and a major setback to Western economy, US economy, US national security. And because the area is also the #1 epicenter of global anti-US terrorism, is going to produce tailwind to anti-US Islamic terrorism on US soil. And while that, plus the encroachment into the soft underbelly of the US, namely the back door of the US, Mexico, and the rest of Latin America, we are witnessing an amazing State Department policy, which from day one, February of 1979, when they took over control of Iran, State Department has embraced the diplomatic option towards the Ayatollahs. They refuse to even consider regime change or military option, deluding themselves in the State Department, which has shaped US policy towards Iran. The delusion is that showering the Ayatollahs with financial and diplomatic gestures, bonanza, namely hundreds of billions of dollars since 1979, that somehow would induce the Ayatollahs to accept peaceful coexistence with their Sunni neighbors, to become also good faith negotiators, and abandon their fanatic, religious, megalomaniacal 1400-year-old vision of taking over the globe, bringing the US to submission. A small element which is ignored by the State Department is that in the Middle East, gestures, concessions are interpreted, and rightly so, as weakness. And weakness whets the appetite of terrorists. Weakness gets the wolves out into the open. And not only that, but we have learned from prior experience that terrorist rogue regimes always, but always, bite the hands that feeds them. And the US should be very much aware of it. The US provided the tailwind which enabled, facilitated the rise to power of the Ayatollahs. And the first thing the Ayatollahs did was taking over the US embassy in Tehran, holding some 50 Americans hostages for 444 days. The US was the power which enabled the Mujahideen to expel the Soviet military from Afghanistan. And what did the Mujahideen do in return? They partook in the planning, execution of September 11, of bombing US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, US Marine barracks and US embassy in Lebanon. And by the way, we have seen that also in Libya 2011, when the State Department at that time under Hillary Clinton, with a very, very significant role played by Tony Blinken, today the Secretary of State. In 2011, Hillary Clinton, Tony Blinken, and other key State Department people engineered a US-led NATO military assault on Gaddafi, who in 2011 was a major warrior against Islamic terrorism. And they took on Gaddafi militarily. They caused his downfall and being lynched by Islamic terrorists in Libya. And that faulty policy by the US has transformed Libya into a lawless, chaotic state until today. Libya is raging with a series of civil wars with the participation of Russia and Turkey and France and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Greece, and few other parties. And certainly Israel learned the lesson of making gestures, extending gestures to rogue elements, and in return getting assaulted by those by those who benefited from those gestures. In 1993, we committed reckless, dramatic gesture towards the PLO, the #1 terror organization in the Middle East, probably in the world at that time. We brought the PLO from distant terrorist camps in Sudan and Yemen and Tunisia into the heart of the land of Israel. And in return, we have been exposed to an unprecedented wave of terrorism, which is raging until today. In 2005, we uprooted our military and civilian presence from Gaza, and in return, we have experienced ongoing wars with Gaza terrorism, all the way to the October 7 horrific terror assault on Israel. And it seems to me that after 45 years of a diplomatic option by the US, it's time for the US to reassess that policy and consider regime change policy until the regime in Iran is altered, is uprooted, is changed. There will not be a change in the volcanic reality caused mostly by the Ayatollahs of Iran in the Middle East and beyond. Until there is a regime change in Iran, the anti-US Islamic terrorism is not going to subside. And that takes realization by the State Department, which we haven't seen yet.
I'm very concerned, as you mentioned, about the connections between Iranian officials and inserted, I would say, in the US administrations in the past. Because it's one thing between Iran using its proxies and surrounding either Israel or, as you mentioned, in Central and South America, surrounding, if you'll call it that, the United States. But I'm worried, I'd like to hear from you on what I see as an infiltration actually within the US administration by Iran itself. And if I may, I'd like to give you some sort of a reference points from my records here. And one of those leads back to an article that was written by Lee Smith, which was published in the Wall Street Journal and the Tablet in October the 2nd, 2023. That was just before we in Israel was preoccupied what happened a few days after that. And he was highlighted, say, high-level Iranian spy busted in D.C. Washington, D.C. is a place that you know very well. And it references the Biden administration's suspending their Iranian envoy, Robert Malley, who helped to support, fund, and direct what they say was an Iranian intelligence operation designed to influence the United States and allied governments. This was further emphasized in the Wall Street Journal by a correspondent, Jay Solomon. They showed that Malley had helped to infiltrate an Iranian agent of influence named Ariana Tabatabi into some of the most sensitive positions in the United States government, first in the State Department and in the Pentagon as well. And she had served as the chief of staff of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Christopher Meyer. And Tabatabi was part of a regime propaganda unit set up in 2014 by the Iranian Foreign Ministry. And she was in contact with the Iranian Foreign Minister all the time. Now, Robert Malley was also the head of the International Crisis Group, which directly paid and credentialed several key members of the Iranian regime's influence operation. It's almost like, if you like, some people talk about the West End executives of Antony Blinken opening the door to interest from outside the United States into the White House, as Blinken said when he was the chief executive of the West End executive. He said, "We bring you from your boardroom to the Situation Room." So what we had here is a situation in which people who were actually very close with the then Iranian Foreign Minister, Zarif, who I think you know, were infiltrated and have been brought into and active in the US administration. I'll give you a quote from another one, by the way. Another operative was called Adnan Tabatani, not related to be confused by the Pentagon official Arian Tabatabi. Arian Tabatabi, by the way, is very closely linked today with Philip Gordon, who you and I mentioned on a previous conversation, because Philip Gordon will be the key man for Kamala Harris if she becomes president. Now, we have Ariana Tabatani, who, by the way, in June of 2014, 10 years ago, she emailed the Iranian foreign minister, Zarani, and said she had been invited to conferences in Saudi Arabia and Israel and asked for his prior approval for her trips. And I quote here, "I would like to ask your opinion to see if you think I should accept the invitations and go." And Zaharani replied, "Saudi Arabia is a good case, but the second case, Israel, is better avoided." Now, these are the people who are in the part of the administration of both Biden and potentially Harris. I don't know if you want to address these issues or share with us some information you may know about.
Well, it shouldn't surprise anyone. As I mentioned before, the takeover of Iran by the Ayatollahs in 1979 was facilitated by the US. And again, it was the State Department which led the way, shaping then President Jimmy Carter's policy, which welcomed Ayatollah Khomeini, assumed, to use the words of President Carter, that Ayatollah Khomeini was going to be preoccupied with tractors, not with tanks. To use the State Department references sent from the US Embassy to Washington, they expected Ayatollah Khomeini to be an Iranian edition of Gandhi. I mean, it was a role model of delusion, role model of detachment from Middle East reality, which sadly has been very typical of the State Department. And here we are, 45 years later, which transformed Iran from the American policeman in the Gulf to the chief global epicenter of anti-American terrorism, anti-American drug trafficking, money laundering, and proliferation of military systems. But the State Department has not changed its policy towards Iran. And reflection of that, beyond the personal association, which is sad and self-destructive, but beyond that, we have the actual policy. When Secretary Blinken entered his office at the State Department in February of 2021, Iran was under economic sanctions, severe sanctions, and therefore was able to export only 500,000 barrels of oil per day. Since that time until today, it has catapulted into 2 to 3 million barrels per day export of oil by Iran, which in dollar terms means that Secretary Blinken awarded the Ayatollahs of Iran since February 2021 with over $175 billion, which were not diverted towards enhanced standard of living, but were directed as expected towards bolstering the anti-American terrorism and anti-American drug trafficking and more entrenched terrorist presence on the border of US and Mexico, and supporting the litany, the large number of Iranian terror sleeper cells on US soil. We have today a policy which delisted the Houthi terrorists in Yemen from the list of terror organizations. It was delisted by Secretary Blinken at his initial days as a Secretary of State, and embracing the Ayatollahs of Iran, literally yearning for another accord, another nuclear accord with Iran, ignoring the ongoing bombing, targeting of US installations in the Gulf area, in Jordan, in Syria, by the Ayatollahs and their proxies in the region. And at the same time, when they appease and court and embrace the Ayatollahs and their proxies in the area, for instance, Hamas, it is the US State Department which is trying to snatch Hamas from the jaws of oblivion by the Israeli military campaign. At the same time, the US State Department has pressured pro-US Egypt, pro-US Saudi Arabia, pro-US United Arab Emirates because of their tough, rough attitude towards the Muslim Brotherhood, which happened to be the largest Sunni terror organization anywhere in the world. But the State Department does not recognize the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. According to the State Department, the Muslim Brotherhood is a social welfare, educational, religious, political, not terroristic organization in defiance of reality, where since 1928, when the Muslim Brotherhood was established, they have haunted every single national Islamic regime. Recently, it means haunting, threatening to topple every single pro-American Arab regime. I don't know how many of our viewers are acquainted with country western music, but there was one of the country western great singers in the 1980s, early 1990s, George Strait. And George Strait had a hit, country western hit, and the lyrics went something like that. I've got some oceanfront property in Arizona, and if you'll buy that, I'll throw the Golden Gate in for free. Well, the State Department really believes that there is an oceanfront property somewhere in Arizona, and they expect even to get the Golden Gate in free. They still do not realize that leopards never change spots. Leopards do change tactics, and especially when they encounter a naive, gullible, detached interlocutor who has no clue about Middle East reality.
And the infiltration, deliberate infiltration by the Iranian regime with people reaching into the heart of the decision-making decisions in the US government is truly, truly troubling. If you take one organization and you go, the Iran Experts Initiative, known as IEI, this was tasked by Iran to get operatives drawn from the Iranian diaspora communities in the United States to promote Iranian interests during the Ayatollah's regime's negotiations with the United States for its nuclear program. Now, if you understand this, you understand how it seems to us that US administrations under Obama and then Biden and potentially under Harris, where they're going soft on the Iranian nuclear ring, it's by design, not by deliberate affirmative policy from the United States, but deliberate affirmative policy from Iran. And the network that I quoted here was funded and supported by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps official, Mustafa Zaharani, who was a point of contact between these Iranian expert initiatives in America and the Iranian then foreign minister, Zarif, and the today current foreign minister as well. And they've recruited some of the names who are still alive and kicking and hyperactive in the current Biden administration and will probably carry on under a Hamas administration by the times. Two of them, Ali Bayez, there's another one, and another name I'll give you is Dina Esfahad Diari, who willingly accepted Iranian guidance, and they are there. These decisions are not being made by Congress. The decision with regard to what the United States will do vis-a-vis to the Iranian advance to a nuclear missile is not done in Congress, but it's done by the bureaucrats and unnamed officials who are actually shoulder to shoulder with the top officials within the White House and the State Department. And this will be carried over from Biden to the Harris administration as well. This is deeply troubling for Israel.
Well, it's again, it should trouble the U.S. As I mentioned before, the U.S., the great American Satan, is the #1 target for Iran. U.S. has the U.S. posture of deterrence has been eroded severely in recent years, and this has been leveraged by the Ayatollahs of Iran to bolster their anti-U.S. penetration of the American hemisphere, again, all the way to the U.S. homeland. But one element which you mentioned I would like to comment on and turn to the viewers, the Americans among our viewers. Do not underestimate the role of House and the Senate of both chambers of Congress in the shaping, not only influencing of U.S. foreign policy and national security policy. Former Secretary of State Jim Baker, who served under Bush, the father Bush, used to complain that every time he comes to Capitol Hill, he encounters 535 legislators who pretend to be secretaries of state. And the reason he mentioned that, the reason he referred to that frustration on his part is because the Congress has the capability, if it wishes, to block presidential policy, to alter presidential policy, to tie the hands of American president, and to introduce and initiate and pass American policy, certainly when it comes to U.S.-Israel relations, when Jim Baker tried in vain to erode the cooperation, but during his time, in defiance of his own policy, his own will, strategic cooperation between U.S. and Israel expanded in an unprecedented manner because of congressional, mostly Senate initiatives. And this is true until today. Congress is not a backseat driver. Congress is a front seat driver, and this is, according to the U.S. Constitution, through a series of checks and balances, has limited considerably the flexibility, the power of the executive, and has extended the oversight capabilities of Congress. And the reason I mention that is that I would urge every viewer who assumes that which Barry and myself has shared with you makes sense, share it with your House representative, share it with your two senators, and don't underestimate the potential of that influencing American policy. There is a saying that sometimes even a blade of a grass can deflect a cannonball. Every one of our viewer has much more potential than a blade of grass, and that could have an impact. And again, don't forget, yes, Israel is severely, negatively impacted by Iran's Ayatollah. But the number one goal of the Ayatollahs of Iran has always been the great American Satan. And by the way, the director of the FBI, Chris Wray, visited Israel in February of 2024. He came to study how do we tackle this horrific terror onslaught on Israel. And according to him, as he said in 4 different hearings, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate, and then a separate presentation he made at the military academy in the USA. He said specifically that October 7 has inspired anti-American, Iranian-supported Islamic terrorists to carry out similar acts of terror on U.S. soil. And to give you a perspective of that, yes, Israel lost 1,200 people on October 7 as a result of the horrific onslaught on Israel, which included killing, mutilation, beheading, raping, and then killing and burning babies to death. But 1,200 in Israel, in fact, equals to some 40,000 Americans in perspective of the population of the U.S. And that means more than 13 9/11. And I suggest that the U.S. takes seriously the FBI director warning that October 7th has inspired anti-American Islamic terrorists. And when they do carry out their threat, when they do implement their threat, then possibly September 11 would be dwarfed by the wrath of Islamic terrorism, which they could practice or exhibit on the soil of the U.S.
I will take your argument one step further, Yoram. If you want to make this the equivalent between America and Israel, I've put it in the past also that if you could imagine this attack that we suffered and consequences since on an American scale, I would go beyond the equivalent number of deaths in America. I would say that also the same terrorists, Iranian-backed proxy terrorists, would have taken somewhere in the region of 3,000 to 4,000 Americans hostage across the border into Mexico. And what would the United States have done then if you had had 4,000 or 5,000 of your citizens being held by a Hamas proxy of Iran in a compliant Mexico, hidden away all over the place, including into terror tunnels you were not aware of? What would the United States do then? Would they then go back, don't compromise, negotiate their freedom or not? I doubt it.
I think we all know what the U.S. would do. What the U.S. would do would produce a barren land, and maybe in 20, 30 years, people are going to study that there used to be a sovereign state bordering the U.S., but it has disappeared as a result of very inhumane terror attack on the U.S. And in order to minimize such actions in the future, the U.S. did the moral and logical thing, namely deter. And you don't deter terrorists by gestures, you deter terrorists by disproportional punishment.
I'd like to end on one note that you raised, Yoram, which is a very interesting one. You talked about the Congress and the importance of Congress. Obviously, people appear in Congress because they take part in the congressional election. I would suggest that a lot of people watching this would take the particular view or should take the view that, in fact, if you're voting for your congressperson, male or female, you should also ask them where they stand with regard to Iran and their nuclear weapon and their malevolent behavior, not only in the Middle East, but also on America's borders and even within America.
Absolutely.
And would you vote for your congressperson in order to set back the advance of Iran, both over here on our own borders, but also on America's borders and even within America, within the establishment that we and I have set out in this conversation between us?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yoram, I want to thank you for your time again, and I hope, listeners, you find this video interesting, informative, and I would ask you to ask what Yoram said and myself as well. Please share it with others, because I think we're giving you some information you may not be aware of. And I think more people, particularly in the United States, should be aware of some of the points that are very concerning to us over here right now. So this is Barry Shaw, The View from Israel. Thank you for joining us.
אנו מכריזים בזאת